The scenes are simply hellish. One death was being recorded every minute.
Somewhere in a filing cabinet there is a document. It has a date, it has a signature, and a number. The number represents how many people were going to get hurt. And underneath that number, someone wrote acceptable. Not by accident, not through negligence, not because they didn't know, because they knew and they decided it was worth doing anyway. This video is about 5 of those documents, 5 different institutions, 5 different eras, 5 different ways of doing the arithmetic, and what happens to the people on the wrong side of those calculations.
Another 50,000 people may suffer serious after effects such as blindness and sterility.
Let's start in New Jersey, 1917, with a job that sounds almost too good to be true. Young women, most of them teenagers, are being hired at the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, for wages double what any other factory in town was paying. The work sounded harmless. You sit at a long table and you dip a fine brush into a jar of luminous paint and you press it between your lips to make the sharp tip, and then you paint tiny little numbers onto the faces of military watch dials. The paint glows in the dark. The work is so precise, so well paid, and so apparently pleasant that women consider it glamorous. They go home with the glow still on their fingers and their faces, their hair. They call themselves ghost girls. They paint their nails with it. They paint their teeth to glow for their boyfriends in the dark. The managers at the Radium Corporation did not paint their teeth. The managers used lead screens, ivory-tipped tongs, and protective masks every time they handled radium. Because they knew, from the moment Mary Curie had discovered it, that radium causes radiation burns. People had already died from it. The managers knew their paint would kill the workers. They calculated that telling the workers would cause them to quit, which would cost money, and decided therefore not to. The first worker to die was a 24-year-old named Amelia Maggia. Her first symptom was toothache. The tooth was removed, then the one next to it, then the jaw. Her jawbone crumbled until it simply fell away from her skull. Her death certificate said syphilis because the company needed a cause of death that was both fatal and embarrassing, something that would make people less likely to ask questions. And it worked. Her family did not question it. By 1924, 50 women who had worked at the factory were ill. A dozen were dead. The corporation finally hired an independent expert from Harvard to investigate. The expert confirmed what the company had always known. The radium was killing the workers. The president of the company buried the report. He commissioned new studies designed to contradict it. He lied to New Jersey's Department of Labor about what the Harvard report had found. When 5 surviving women, some of them so sick they couldn't raise their hands to be sworn in at trial, finally sued in 1927, the company's legal strategy was delay. Well, they knew the women were dying. They just needed to run the clock down until there was no one left to testify. The judge hearing the case, it later emerged, held stocks in the United States Radium Corporation. The women were labeled the living dead by the newspapers. They eventually won a settlement. Every single one of them died before the appeals were exhausted. The company never admitted liability. Fast forwards to 1946, a United States Navy Commodore named Ben Wyatt travels to a tiny Pacific island called Bikini Atoll. The island has 167 inhabitants. It is, by every account, a paradise. Clear water, coconut palms, ancient fishing grounds that have fed the same families for 3,000 years. Wyatt waits until Sunday. Then, right after church service, he assembles the entire population and delivers a speech that might be the most cynical sentence ever uttered in the name of science.
Now, James, will you tell them that the United States government now wants to turn this great destructive force into something good for mankind?
He asks the Bikini people to leave their home for the good of mankind and the end of world wars. The military governor compared them, in his speech, to the children of Israel, a chosen people asked to sacrifice for a higher purpose.
Everything being in God's hands, it must be good.
He did not mention that when he gave the speech, the lagoon was already filling up with 242 warships. He also did not mention that there were 42,000 US military personnel already on their way. He did not mention that there were 25,000 radiation recordings devices, 200 pigs, 204 goats, and 5,000 rats being assembled to see what a nuclear bomb does to living tissue. The Bikini people had very little English. One word stood out: mankind. Their chief, King Judah, recognized it from the Bible, and so after confused and sorrowful deliberation, he stood up and said, "We will go, believing that everything is in the hands of God." A US officer later called the exchange one hell of a good sales job. The people of Bikini were taken to Rongerik, a sandbar island 1/6 of the size of their home, with no food, no fish, and no resources. Within a year, they were starving. The Navy didn't check on them for 12 months. When they finally did, the medical officer found a community on the edge of collapse. But the real betrayal was still coming, because the promise that they could return was a lie the US government had calculated in advance. Tests contaminated Bikini so severely that it remains uninhabitable, not for decades, for an estimated 30,000 years. A 2016 Columbia University study found radiation levels on the atoll almost double what is considered safe for human habitation. The children of the original relocated families have now been displaced 3 times. They have never been able to go home. A decade later, in the late 1950s, approximately 22,000 British servicemen, most of them on compulsory national service, so teenagers who had no choice about being there, were sent to Christmas Island in the Pacific to participate in Britain's hydrogen bomb tests. What happened to them there is documented in their own words. On test days, the soldiers were ordered out of their barracks and lined up on the beach. They were told to turn their backs to the blast, cover their eyes with their fists, and wait. When the bomb detonated, the flash was so bright that the veterans described seeing the bones of their hands through their closed eyelids, like an X-ray. One veteran described the moment, "I thought it was a volcano exploding." You can't describe it. It was a massive ball of fire, and then a deafening roar. After the flash, they were told it was safe. The army cooks went back to preparing lunch. The aircraft mechanics returned to vehicle maintenance. The men went swimming in the lagoon, ate fish they caught in the blast zone, drank rainwater collected in tarps. Very few were given dosimeters. The little badges that measure radiation exposure. In 1958, a memo from Air Vice Marshal John Grandy to the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment explained why. Issuing radiation badges might provoke anxiety among the servicemen. In other words, they didn't want the men to know how much radiation they were absorbing. So they just decided not to measure it. Decades later, veterans reported cancer, sterility, genetic disorders in their children and grandchildren. Some daughters of veterans told researchers they had chosen not to have children because they were too afraid of what they might pass on. That is a behavior researchers note, normally only seen in families carrying confirmed hereditary conditions like cystic fibrosis. The British government has never paid compensation to nuclear test victims. The legal cases brought by over 1,000 veterans were thrown out by the Supreme Court on the grounds that too much time had passed. When veterans asked for their own medical records, the Ministry of Defense told them, "We lost them." In January 1965, 4 American chemical companies sat down together for a meeting. On the agenda, what to do about dioxin. Dow Chemical, Diamond Alkali, Hercules Power, and the Hooker Chemical Corporation were all manufacturing a herbicide called 2,4,5-T. They had known since at least 1957, because a German chemical company had warned them in advance in writing, that the dioxin contaminating their manufacturing process was, in their words, extraordinarily dangerous. Workers at the plant were developing chloracne, a severe skin disease caused by dioxin exposure. The meeting's minutes recorded one attendee noting that affected employees had developed symptoms as much as 30 years after a single contact. The companies decided not to go public with this information. Instead, they drafted a confidentiality agreement and discussed how to minimize the presence of this known agent, while keeping information between themselves. Less than a year later, the US military was spraying 19 million gallons of dioxin-contaminated Agent Orange across the forests of farmland in Vietnam.
It was one way we were going to win the Vietnam War, dump herbicides all over the jungle so the Viet Cong would come out and fight.
In 1988, Dr. James Clary, an Air Force researcher who had designed the spray tanks for the program, wrote to a senator. His letter contained a sentence that should be read slowly. When we initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for damage due to dioxin contamination in the herbicide. However, because the material was to be used on the enemy, none of us were overly concerned. We never considered a scenario in which our own personnel would become contaminated. The dioxin contaminated breast milk, it contaminated soil that still cannot grow weeds in some areas today. It produced birth defects in the children of veterans and birth defects in the children of those children. The Vietnamese Red Cross has estimated 3 million people were affected. In 1984, the chemical company settled a lawsuit brought by American veterans, without admitting liability, for $180 million. The average payout per veteran was $1,200. I mean, the companies had done the arithmetic. It was cheaper to settle than to prevent it. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, in the city of Bhopal, India, an operator at the Union Carbide pesticide plant noticed the pressure rising in one of the storage tanks. He noted it in his logbook and then he went for a tea break. Well, this tank contained methyl isocyanate, a gas so toxic that exposure to a fraction of a teaspoon of it in the air will cause immediate blindness, chemical burns to the lungs, and death. Spicy stuff. The safety system that should have contained the pressure, the vent gas scrubber, the flare tower, the refrigeration unit, had all been shut down to cut costs. The tank alarms had not been working for about 4 years. There was a single manual backup system instead of the 4-stage system used at Union Carbide's plant in the United States. By 2 a.m., 40 tons of the gas had escaped into a city of 1 million sleeping people. People woke up with burning eyes and they couldn't breathe. They ran blindly through the streets with gas burning their lungs, holding children, falling, trampling each other. By morning, the streets around the plant were lined with bodies. Estimates of the immediate death toll range anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 people. In the years since, gas-related diseases have killed perhaps 20,000 more. 500,000 survivors developed chronic respiratory conditions, eye damage, neurological disorders. Many were awarded compensation of a few $100s. Well, here's what we now know was in the files at Union Carbide before the disaster. In 1982, the company conducted its own safety audit of the Bhopal plant. The audit identified serious hazards, including risks specifically related to the MIC storage tanks. Those hazards were not addressed. In 2002, internal documents revealed that the technology used for MIC manufacturing at Bhopal was classified by the company as unproven technology that had never been properly tested, installed specifically because it was cheaper than the methods used in the United States. When the Indian government charged Union Carbide's CEO, Warren Anderson, with culpable homicide, he was released from custody within hours, flown out of India on a government plane, and never returned to face trial. He died in Florida in 2014 at the age of 92 in a retirement community, having lived his entire post-Bhopal life in comfort. In 1989, Union Carbide settled with the Indian government for $470 million, less than 2 cents per dollar of what the company was worth and insured for at the time of the disaster. The company described 1989, the year of the settlement, as its best financial year on record. The contaminated plant site was abandoned. More than 400 tons of industrial waste were left on the ground. The toxins seeped into the soil and groundwater. 40 years later, studies still link contamination to chronic illness and birth defects in children born near the site, children who were never originally exposed to the gas at all. There is a thread connecting all 5 of these stories, and it's not cruelty. Cruelty is emotional. What connects all of these stories is far colder than cruelty. In New Jersey in the 1920s, the Radium Corporation looked at its workers and calculated that replacing them was cheaper than warning them. In the Pacific in 1946, the US government looked at 167 islanders and calculated that their home was worth more as a bomb site than as a place for human beings to live. In the Christmas Islands in the 1950s, the British military decided that measuring radiation exposure would cause anxiety, so they decided not to measure it. In Midland, Michigan in '65, 4 chemical companies sat in a room with a document describing a substance they would call extraordinarily dangerous and decided that confidentiality was worth more than the lives of the soldiers who would be walking through it. In Bhopal in 1984, a corporation installed cheaper safety equipment because it ran the numbers and decided it was fine. None of these were accidents. Every single one of them was a decision. The document exists. The number is on it. And underneath the number, someone wrote acceptable.